In the summer of 2024, Boeing's Starliner spacecraft failed once again, but Elon Musk wasn't surprised. He had long warned about the flaws in Boeing's approach to space travel, and this failure only seemed to prove him right. While SpaceX was launching successful crewed missions, Boeing couldn't even complete a basic flight. So, what does Elon think is really behind Starliner's failure? Is Boeing's downfall inevitable as SpaceX keeps dominating? Boeing's golden age and the start of its decline make it hard to believe the company is messing up so badly, given its history. For years, Boeing was the top name in aerospace, whether it was building airplanes or spacecraft. They were the leaders in innovation, but the Starliner disaster has tarnished that reputation. Before we dig deeper, let's take a step back and remember what Boeing once was. Their legacy in aerospace was unmatched for decades. They built the first stage booster for NASA's Saturn V rocket, which sent humans to the moon. Boeing also built the lunar rover, the buggy astronauts drove on the moon, and played a major role in the space shuttle program. Even the International Space Station has parts built by Boeing, and they constructed the Delta IV rocket used in numerous space missions. Back in the day, you'd trust them with the future of space exploration without a second thought. So, when NASA handed over its commercial crew program to Boeing, no one was surprised. Boeing was the safe bet. They always delivered. But as the Starliner saga unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't the same Boeing that once sent astronauts to the moon. Something had changed. Looking back, the warning signs were there long before Starliner ever launched. The trouble began in 1997 when Boeing bought McDonnell Douglas for $14 billion, a massive deal at the time. But this wasn't just a financial transaction. It marked the beginning of Boeing's cultural shift. Before the merger, Boeing was known as an engineers company, where engineers called the shots and quality and safety were the top priorities. Profits came second. But after the merger, McDonnell Douglas' corporate mindset, which emphasized profits and shareholders over innovation, took hold. Boeing was no longer the company that built the Saturn V. It had started to lose its way. You might have heard the saying that McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's own money. It's a bit of a joke, but there's truth to it. After the merger, Boeing's focus shifted from engineering excellence to cutting costs and pleasing shareholders. Engineers, once at the company's core, were pushed aside, and that's when things began to unravel. It took years for the cracks to show, but when they did, it wasn't pretty. The Starliner disaster is just one example of how Boeing's cultural shift led to major failures. The Starliner project began in 2010 under NASA's Commercial Crew Program, aimed at developing spacecraft to replace the retiring shuttle fleet. Boeing received $18 million to kick off Starliner development, with plans to have it ready by 2015. Given Boeing's history, few doubted them at the time. But delays soon followed. By 2015, Starliner's test flight had been pushed to 2017, then 2019. By now, people were asking, what was taking so long? Where was the Boeing that had once built lunar rovers and shuttles without breaking a sweat? One reason NASA kept giving Boeing more chances was their history of cost-plus contracts, which allowed Boeing to bill the government for expenses plus a fee, essentially rewarding higher spending. But for Starliner, NASA switched to a fixed-price contract, meaning Boeing had to cover any extra cost themselves. This forced Boeing to cut corners to save money, which led to problems. When Starliner finally launched in December 2019, it should have been a success. Instead, it was a disaster. A simple error in setting the spacecraft's clock caused it to veer off course, using too much fuel and missing its target, the International Space Station. To make matters worse, a second software bug, discovered just before re-entry, nearly caused a catastrophic collision. Although Starliner safely returned to Earth, Boeing's reputation had taken a major hit. Boeing versus SpaceX, a tale of cultures and failures. Remember, Boeing wasn't the only company NASA turned to for its commercial crew program. At the same time Boeing was tasked with building Starliner, NASA also chose a younger, more ambitious company, SpaceX. The result? A classic old guard versus new blood showdown, and spoiler alert, the new blood won. In 2014, NASA split its commercial crew contracts between Boeing and SpaceX. It seemed like a solid plan. Boeing, the veteran aerospace giant, got $4.2 billion to develop Starliner, while SpaceX, the upstart, received $2.6 billion to build Crew Dragon. Most people would have bet on Boeing to deliver faster and more efficiently. With decades of experience, they seemed like a sure bet. But, as we now know, it was SpaceX that delivered. Why? It all comes down to the company's cultures. At SpaceX, engineers were still in charge, and innovation wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded. Elon Musk pushed boundaries and embraced risk to achieve groundbreaking results. Failure at SpaceX wasn't feared. It was seen as a chance to learn and improve. This allowed them to move quickly, make mistakes, and fix them just as fast. Boeing, however, was stuck in its old ways. The corporate culture had shifted away from engineering excellence to focusing on shareholders and cost-cutting. Engineers were no longer leading the charge, and decisions were driven more by business sense than by boldness. That's not how you win in space exploration. Astronaut Doug Hurley, who worked with both companies, saw this firsthand. SpaceX engineers were open to feedback and eager to collaborate, while Boeing's engineers seemed overconfident and dismissive. This overconfidence led to a series of setbacks for Boeing. By 2020, SpaceX had launched its first crewed mission to the ISS, a huge milestone. Meanwhile, Boeing was still struggling with Starliner. After a failed 2019 test flight, Boeing's problems kept piling up. In 2021, their fuel valves malfunctioned, delaying another launch. While SpaceX soared with Crew Dragon's success, Boeing was mired in blame games with Aerojet Rocketdyne over thruster malfunctions. It was a mess, and NASA watched as Boeing stumbled again and again. In 2022, Boeing managed to get Starliner to the ISS, but even that was shaky. Multiple thrusters failed during key moments, tarnishing what should have been a win. While Starliner completed the mission, it was far from smooth. Compared to SpaceX's polished operations, Boeing's efforts seemed amateurish. As Boeing struggled, SpaceX looked to the future, focusing on bigger goals like sending humans to Mars. The gap between the two companies widened. SpaceX became NASA's preferred partner, while Boeing's reputation suffered. By June 2024, Boeing was finally ready for Starliner's first crewed mission. This was supposed to be their comeback, with astronauts Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams at the helm. But the road to redemption for Boeing had been anything but easy. Right from the start, things went downhill. The first launch attempt was scrubbed due to an oxygen valve issue on the Atlas V rocket. It was frustrating, but Boeing quickly rescheduled for a few days later. However, when they tried again, a computer error in the ground system caused another delay. By this point, people began to wonder if Boeing was cursed. Surely nothing else could go wrong, right? Wrong. On the third attempt, astronauts Wilmore and Williams had quite a ride. Shortly after reaching orbit, they began testing Starliner's thrusters in both automated and manual modes. During the stress test, the performance of the RCS thrusters deteriorated. By the end of the test, 5 thrusters were deemed unusable. To make things worse, a helium leak was found in the spacecraft's gas system. If you know anything about spaceflight, you know thrusters are crucial for maneuvering, especially when docking with something as large as the ISS. With 5 thrusters down, Starliner was in serious jeopardy. For about an hour, the spacecraft hovered just out of reach of the space station while engineers on the ground scrambled for a solution. They eventually got 4 of the disabled thrusters working again, and Starliner docked, but everyone knew the mission had been far from smooth. Boeing had avoided a full-blown disaster, but barely. The thruster problems left NASA and Boeing engineers questioning why they had failed, and more critically, whether they could be trusted for the return to Earth. That uncertainty led NASA to make a tough call. They weren't going to risk lives. Instead of bringing Wilmore and Williams home on Starliner, NASA chose SpaceX's Crew Dragon. It was a huge embarrassment for Boeing, a company that had once sent astronauts to the moon but now couldn't safely bring them home. After the third scrub launch and near disaster, NASA had to decide: stick with Boeing or rely on the proven reliability of SpaceX. Spoiler: NASA went with SpaceX. It was a defining moment. Boeing, once a giant in aerospace, was now seen as the underdog. How did it come to this? It all traces back to Boeing's shift from being engineering-driven to cost-cutting and shareholder-focused, a change that began with the McDonnell-Douglas merger. The Starliner failure, especially after the thruster issues in June 2024, exposed Boeing's corporate rot. The problem had something to do with Teflon seals in the thruster oxygen valves, which expanded underheat and restricted the flow of oxidizer. But why hadn't they caught this issue sooner? Boeing Starliner had flown 2 successful missions, but during this third attempt, a thruster issue arose that they couldn't replicate during testing. Boeing didn't know what was wrong, making it impossible to guarantee a safe return. NASA couldn't take that risk, so they delayed the mission for months. Astronauts Wilmore and Williams, stuck on the ISS, had enough supplies but faced an uncertain return. Boeing insisted everything was fine, but behind the scenes, they were scrambling. By August 2024, the issue was traced to overheating Teflon seals in the thrusters, but Boeing still didn't know why it hadn't happened before. NASA decided to send Starliner back to Earth empty, disrupting the flight schedule. Wilmore and Williams had to return via SpaceX's Crew Dragon, which caused logistical headaches for NASA. This debacle highlighted a bigger issue. Boeing was struggling to adapt to the fast-paced space industry led by innovators like SpaceX. While Boeing stuck to old ways, SpaceX thrived by embracing risk and pushing boundaries. As a result, NASA increasingly relied on SpaceX for human space exploration. Now, Boeing faces tough choices: cancel the Starliner program or pour more resources into fixing it. But with the ISS nearing the end of its lifespan, time is running out. Meanwhile, SpaceX continues to lead, pushing toward Mars, the Moon, and beyond. The lesson? Space is hard, and complacency isn't an option. Boeing must evolve or risk being left behind as SpaceX leads the way into the future.